Hello, welcome to another EF Core Community Stand-Up. We are here today with Rick Anderson, doc writer extraordinaire for ASP.NET Core. Rick is primarily responsible, I think, for Razor pages with EF Core, MVC with EF Core, the multi-part tutorials on the doc site that are really awesome and great intro to or detailed accounts of using EF Core with ASP.NET Core. So he's going to be talking to us all about ASP.NET Core and EF Core. And before we get started on that, let's just do a quick look at what's going on in the world of the unicorn. So EF Core 6.0, get 6.0 now, the GA version pretty much. It's only in a daily build, but you can get it now. We're not really adding anything more to it. We're pretty much at this time where if it doesn't melt down your computer, then it's not going into GA. Created a little AKSMS link to make it easy for you to find it, EF Core Daily Builds. Let's just go take a quick look at what that page is. All you need to do is put nuget.config next to your solution or your project file and add this line into it, .NET 6. This is the pet feed, and then you'll get the daily build packages available for you. So it's super easy. What else? So Jeremy and myself took the content from our last community stand-up, which was temporal tables, and put it into a .NET blog. So if you go look on the .NET blog, we have this theme to a certain movie, SQL Server temporal tables in EF Core 6.0, which has basically the stuff we did on the stand-up. And there's a link off also to a GitHub repo with the code in there that you can download and play with and run and everything. So check that out. And then finally coming up here is the fancy professional type conference, .NET Conf 2021, for which they've roped me into doing this as well. So Jeremy and I have a session on the first day. So if you go, this is the conference website, this has been show linked. You can go down here, and after all the important people, check out the agenda. And so on the first day, we have, this is showing UK time, by the way. So I'm going to be doing this live at 10:30 p.m. I think it's, what time is that in in Pacific time. Does anyone remember?
2:30.
2:30 in the afternoon. So better if you're on the West Coast. So this is me and Jeremy doing this one. And then you're on the second day, Jeremy, with the GraphQL stuff.
You got it right at 2 p.m. my time, so 10 years. Yep.
So GraphQL with the F-Core. So awesome stuff there. So this is the official conference stuff. So they have more rules and everything, and I have to be behaved. No Public Enemy T-shirts allowed. So I guess I can't do nothing for you, man, about that. But we'll get right back and bring the noise with Rick Anderson now to talk about ASP.NET Core. Rick?
Hi. So I don't have a lot prepared, but we have the introductory tutorials on ASP.NET and Razor Pages, which is really geared more to getting started with Razor Pages. But our main tutorial is get started with let's see, what is it? Do you have that? Can somebody post the link to that? Razor Pages and Entity Framework Core, which is a 7-part tutorial on using Entity Framework with Razor Pages. And Jeremy was nice enough to update all the code to 5.0, EF 5.0, and ASP.NET Core 5.0. And we hope to get that updated to 6.0 soon. And we also have a probably more popular one, the MVC version of that's quite out of date. And we're looking for some help to get that updated. So
there we go. I've got the Razor Pages link scrolling across the bottom in a ticker now. But do we want to open that up? Maybe take a gander at the module. Does that make sense?
Sure, that'd be great.
Let me see if I can bring that up. Sorry about this. Not prepared. See, you can't be like this on a real conference. You got to be all and everything.
Yes.
Okay, so add that stream.
And for those people watching this too, as you have questions, feel free to throw them out in chat. We are answering real time, and what we're focused on mainly, I mean, we'll look at other questions, but our main focus is ASP.NET Core and EF Core together. So Arthur has the tutorial pulled up for Razor Pages.
Is that the one we want to start with, or we should go with MVC one? Let's start with Razor Pages.
We should probably start with this one. This one, I think, because this one's using the best practices,
right?
And it's got the the most efficient queries and stuff in it, and it's really, if you're gonna even if you're gonna do MVC, you'd probably be doing yourself a big favor to go through this one too. And until we can get the MVC one updated, because there's quite a few improvements in the Razor Pages.
So for people who don't know, Rick, can you give us just a quick rundown about what the difference is between Razor Pages and MVC? Because maybe I do this one and I decide, I don't want to do MVC after all, because this is cool, right?
Yeah. So Razor Pages are organized around pages. And so you have together, you have your UI code, your Razor Pages file, and then you have a code behind, which are really attached together. And in Visual Studio, and even in Visual Studio Code. And so you don't have to go from the controller folder way off into the views folder to work on them. And Razor Pages is MVVM model, And we feel that it's better for most new applications, and it's a more productive way. And we've got a lot of customers that attest to that they're more productive. I know if you've got a lot of MVC code and that's what your company's using, then by all means stick with that. But it's really not that hard to convert from one to the other. But they do have a very different structure.
So you'll probably end up having an easier time starting with Razor Pages if you're starting something new. Less boilerplate code, less stuff to connect up. It's all just going to be easier, basically.
And especially if you start with .NET 6. I mean,
right.
the .NET 6 minimal hosting model removes all that ceremony, and it's got really nice default initialization. So there's a lot less code involved. For a minimal app, you can write one in 4 lines, and ASP.NET Core 5 and .NET 5, it was three files and 45 lines of code. So it's the minimal hosting model in .NET 6 is a lot nicer.
Yeah, I've taken a look at this, and I was very excited to see this trend towards a very kind of minimal API, basically. One more thing to add. So we're just discussing these two ASP.NET models, Razor Pages and MVC. Obviously, there's also Blazor as yet another thing. So when you're starting out with ASP.NET, you have all these options. And we also have documentation on how Blazor works with EF as well. So all these are important things.
Yeah, and Blazor is interesting. I mean, MVC itself is one of those product names that it was named after a pattern, but it's really a platform, so that I know lends some confusion. But it's ironic. I wrote an article in 2011, I think, Silverlight Days, right, about the model view model pattern, and really dug into the history of MVC and MVVM. And it's interesting to see how those paradigms work, because MVVM works really well in Blazor, especially client side, because there's no round tripping, right? It's state in the browser, whereas MVC for the web host model seems to work well.
Okay, so let's take a look. So it builds a sample app for our well-known Tosco University. You want to go over what we're actually building in the tutorial, Rick?
Yeah, that's right. And then it goes on to, it uses the scaffolding engine to generate all the code. So it's a really good start to make a CRUD application. Scaffoldr really gives you a big boost. But then the rest of the tutorial is, well, a real app isn't just a simple CRUD application. So it goes on to show how you can sort, filter, and group, and it gives you the link that you can use with Entity Framework, and then it just builds from there. But at the whole time, it's showing you what you have to do in the UI to make it nice for ASP.NET Core. Although the focus of it is on Entity Framework, but they both work together.
Right. Then, so go ahead. Sorry.
No, that's good. Go ahead. Go.
So interesting here. Like maybe we'll talk a little about using a repository or not using a repository. This is something that comes up quite a lot. Maybe I can say something, and then Rick, you can give your thoughts on that. So it used to be kind of, I don't know, 10 years ago, maybe it used to be the recommended wisdom that you always use the repository pattern. I think that's one of Fowler's patterns, right? In applications of enterprise architecture. And that would abstract away basically your database from your application code. And that often went along with a unit of work pattern. where you collected a bunch of things together into a single unit of work and then executed them together on the database. You can still do that, and there's value in doing that in some situations. In particular, if you really want to do isolated unit testing on parts of your application, it's a lot easier to mock or create test doubles for a repository than it is to create it for, say, dbContext, which is very tied to the actual database doing work. But in a lot of cases, you don't need to do that, and you can just use dbContext with its db sets and its save changes and change tracker as kind of a combination of a repository and of unit work together. And I think that's what we're doing in this sample, right, Rick?
Yeah, that's right. You know, I think 5 or maybe 6 years ago, we had a contractor helping out, and he insisted that everything had to use the repository. He was very insistent on that. And, you know, we found that it really kind of lost focus on these introductory tutorials and even advanced ones. So, and we got a lot of feedback from customers, you know, both for and against. So what we did was we removed the repository, and we found that we had a much higher customer success rate getting through the tutorial. And they were able to add a repository later on if they weren't, but it really was a big speed up. And you know, all the information I have on it is very anecdotal.
Yeah.
But I've talked to a lot of customers that are writing real production apps, and they're not using a repository pattern. They're just using dbContext, and they're very happy with it. And I will tell you, my all the tutorials that we got rid of the repository, we got an automatic immediate boost of about 6 points in customer satisfaction. So, you know, I'm sort of biased against, you know, jumping in and adding a repository right at the beginning, because we did get that. And, you know, we've got a bunch of people that complain bitterly about not having it, but they're a very small minority, a very passionate minority.
Well,
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I love the idea of patterns, because there's a pattern called Yagni, right? You aren't going to need it.
Yeah.
And that I think was the best pattern that I learned, is that you can refactor things down the road. You know, the one use case I found that works well for repository is when you want to have a similar API on your client and server. So you can create a repository that has an asynchronous get items, and you can implement it as EF core versus API call. But outside of that, I mean, dbContext, you can create an interface, you can test it. So it's got all the elements needed.
It's a question of simplicity and abstractions, I think. You know, it's like basically keep things simple. You know, I remember, I think Nick Craver was on the show a few weeks ago, and he said, just keep things simple, keep things simple. And, you know, lots of the people I respect most in the software engineering world will say to you, just keep things simple. So if you feel like you're adding a repository just because, you know, you feel like that's the right thing to do, or that's what somebody's told you to do, but you're not adding any value from it, then you're adding complexity without any value. And you're adding complexity by adding an abstraction, right? And whenever you add an abstraction, that adds the complexity. So if you need that abstraction, Jeremy's point being a great example, you want to abstract between the client and server, then use a repository, because you're adding value by creating the abstraction you need. But if you don't need it, then don't add it and keep your code simple, because complex code is what kills everything, right? when humans can't understand it anymore, which happens very quickly, I think, it gets much harder. So that's probably quite controversial, some of that stuff, and people are going to be yelling at us, but you make it simpler by using patterns. But anyway,
just one additional note, because this is a subject that everybody has an opinion on, including me, of course. But what Arthur was saying before is very important. So one of the main places where we do think there's a lot of value is when you are doing unit testing. And one of my goals in this phase, like in the next couple of weeks, is to actually revamp revamp the EF testing docs to make it clear when you would want to use integration testing, how you would go about doing that successfully, when you want to do unit testing, and when you would use a repository pattern in unit testing, and what the different approaches are. But that's definitely, so first of all, look forward to this. But in general, that's definitely one of the key scenarios where you do want to maybe use a repository. But I totally agree with what everybody said. It's not something that should be done as a cargo cult, as like every single application should absolutely have a repository pattern. It should be on a very case-by-case basis based on your specific scenario.
So let me just add something concrete about the testing thing. The real problem, fundamental problem, is testing link. So if you write a link query and then if you have your application basically create an iQueryable and send it to EF to evaluate, and then you want to write a testable for that, that's incredibly difficult. Basically, what you have to do is be able to understand what that link query is. So you can get around this or not get around it, but you can deal with this problem in various ways. One thing is to not try and do that and to use a database to run the link query on all the time in your tests. And I think we've certainly found that to be very effective as with the speed the databases are these days. Another way is to create a repository which explicitly does not expose iQuerybles, but exposes methods that do specific things, which is really what the repository pattern, in its pure form, is supposed to do. So it gives you customers with their addresses, for example. You can then mock that because you don't have to understand what the link is. You're intercepting it before you get to writing a link query, and you can return customers and their addresses. And that fundamentally different way of testing. That being said, exposing the iQueryable directly into your application so that they can do what they write link queries in the application is very powerful and very useful, and generally a lot simpler than having a repository where you predefine all the things you need to do, even with pattern objects and things like that. So it's really does depend what you need. But we've probably gone too long on this now. Let's get back to ASP.NET Core, sir.
So probably the next big chapter is on migrations, and when I wrote the first ASP.NET Core tutorial, the real simple one, was it Arthur? What do you got? I think it was Arthur. Maybe it was Diego sent me an email saying, "Hey, you got to work in migrations."
Yeah.
In this, and I thought, migrations, who cares about migrations? So I reluctantly added it, and in the in the ASP.NET Core version 1, and then I found out how incredibly useful they were after that. But when in this Razor Pages one, by the way, this entire tutorial, Tom Dykstra wrote the original one. And then, like I mentioned, Jeremy updated it, and SQLite was always kind of a stepchild, kind of a last thought, got the least attention. We tried to sort of kind of make it work with that. And in the early versions, if we ever had any problems with the migrations, which we did early on, we would say, well, with SQLite, don't use migrations, just delete the database and start over. But it's my impression that the EF folks are more like to use SQLite more than us. And so I think, Jeremy, didn't you do all your work with SQLite when you were?
Well, I was going to say I do SQLite quite a bit, but it's mainly because of cross-platform. So if I'm demoing or instructing, I want to give something that's really easy for someone to run on Linux or Mac or Windows. In production, SQL Server, Postgres, MySQL, these come into play a lot more. But definitely for demo apps and tutorials that I want it to be very simple to run on any platform, SQLite is the way I go.
So Jeremy handed me off everything in SQLite, and everything seemed to be working. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the migration support gets better with every version. And I think maybe everything we do in this tutorial is now supported with SQLite. I know I got a few months ago, I got an issue in saying, hey, you tell them to punt here and don't use migrations. They don't work in SQLite. Well, they do actually now.
Yes.
So
Yeah, let me talk about that a little more. So Bryce Lamston, who's on the EF Data team here, he's responsible for a lot of both the SQLite work and the migrations work. So the Microsoft Data SQLite ADO.NET provider is pretty much Bryce's work entirely. That's his kind of his pet project, if you like. And it now supports a lot of things that were not supported in SQLite in terms of mapping, doing appropriate things with decimal columns, because SQLite has a unusual type system, which makes it behave differently in some ways. And at the same time as that, we've Bryce really has improved the migration support for SQLite to the extent that we got to the point in 6.0 where things now work on SQLite that don't work on SQL Server, which is really the first time that we've got there with migrations. But yeah, it used to be the case. I think there's this SQLite limitations here. This needs to be updated. So SQLite natively doesn't have a lot of support for changing your database in fairly discrete steps. So, being able to rename columns, for example. So that's got better in SQLite itself and in the ADO.NET provider, and migrations now takes care of that. So you can rename a column, which you couldn't before. But then there's also things like where you actually need to do what we call a table rebuild, which is essentially where you drop the entire table and you recreate it again because you can't change it in the way you want to. And Bryce worked really hard on making that work in SQLite. That doesn't work in SQL Server. We can't do full table rebuilds in SQL Server, and that's primarily because SQL Server is incredibly complicated in everything that it supports on the table. So the chance that you actually rebuild it correctly is scary. It's scary to think of all the things that could go wrong there. And so, that I don't know we'll ever do that because it's just too complicated. But that's not so much of a problem on SQL Server because it allows you to do more things to change the table, whereas on SQLite doesn't. But having the table rebuilds in SQLite means, for example, that you can change column orders now in SQLite, and you can tell EF, actually, I want this column to be before that column. And you can't do that on SQL Server or SQLite without rebuilding the table. I think MySQL allows you to move columns around or something, but now because SQLite can rebuild the table, it means you can create a migration and it will just move your column orders around. So yeah, it definitely used to be the case that SQLite wasn't great for doing migrations, but that is massively improved in 5.0 and it's even better in 6.0. So we'll get this updated to 6.0 and change some of these limitations.
So I've had a few customers tell me they run SQLite on Azure because it's free, right? Isn't it basically free on Azure to run SQLite? And they didn't want to pay for SQL Server. So
that's interesting. I mean, there's also other free open source database options like MySQL or Postgres as well. I mean, I'm interested because SQLite has the limitations of concurrent usage, and it wasn't exactly made for a lot of concurrent usage from a web app and so on. But just because I already stole, just because I'm already talking, one other intriguing usage of SQLite is in various, mobile or even WASM scenarios where if you're using something like Maui or Xamarin to write, and you're using EF to write a mobile application. Typically, there you will not be connecting to an actual SQL Server database, right? What you will be doing is having a local SQLite database. And you can query that using EF Core with Link. And this is a scenario that we aim to improve in EF Core 7. That's one of our major things for the next release, by the way.
Yeah, so I think the fundamental difference between SQLite and the other databases is that SQLite is basically accessing a file on your file system, just a file on your local file. I mean, you can put it on a network share or something, but effectively it's using the file system to access the database, and it's running in process. So you're not sending a TCP packet or something, even to localhost. You're not doing any of that stuff. You're just going to a file access on your local file system. So yeah, you can use it pretty much anywhere. It doesn't require any setup. You can use it on mobile devices. Like Rick said, you can put it on Azure without paying for any kind of database server because it's just a file in your file system, right? And so, yeah, it's super useful. But then it's limited. Like if you do have thousands of concurrent users trying to access single file on your file system, it's probably not going to scale that well. So, horses for courses. It also will run in memory, by the way. You can have purely in-memory relational database with SQLite, which is also pretty cool and very fast.
So we had this question come up. I thought that was interesting. Is the reason Microsoft prefers code first instead of database first? And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not sure we actually have a preference. We try to support both scenarios, but do you have thoughts on either?
I can talk, or if Rick has some thoughts, he can.
No, go ahead. That's database. That they defer to you.
So firstly, the terms code first and database. Shall I tell my story, my marketing story about code first? Okay, so basically we had when when Entity Framework 1.0 came out, it supported what we call model first and database first. And the idea there was you either started with a database and you reverse engineered that database into a designer, and then you had the model with lines and boxes, and you could manipulate it and then create code from that. Or you started with a blank canvas in the designer and you use that to create the model by drawing lines and stuff, and that was called model first. Okay. And then there was this thing that a bunch of people started prototyping called code only, and the idea there was don't have any database at all initially. Just start writing code and then have the code create the database. But really, even that is you don't actually have to have the code creating the database. It's really just saying I'm creating mappings in code. So rather than having an XML file or something like that, you're really just putting those mappings in code. Now, when we had we had database first and model first and code only, and the marketing people thought, well, we should call that one code first because that fits with the other two and it'll sound great and everything. But it really gave the impression that what you had to do was write the code first and then create the database from it. And that's not true. What all code first means is your mappings are in code. So they're in, the Lambda expressions, the model builder do this, or you write your DB sets and you put attributes on the entity types and then it says required. And we know, okay, that means you're mapping it to a non-nullable column. It doesn't mean that you have to use that to create the database. The database could already exist with that non-nullable column. And it's just like writing a line in an XML file that says, map this property to a non-nullable column. So code first is a very bad name for what it does.
More like code as source of truth, maybe? Would that be like a more accurate way, maybe?
Code-based, code-based mapping is what it is, really. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So now when you talk about database first versus code first in kind of in the EF core era, in the modern times, they all use the mapping in the code. We don't have any XML file. There's no EDMX behind the code anymore, right? So that doesn't actually fundamentally change anything. It's just that you always write your mapping in code. But you can start, just like if we go back to the very beginning, you can start with an existing database, reverse engineer it. Instead of getting an XML file that you load in the designer, you get a dbContext with model creating or with attributes or whatever, and that's your mapping. But it still maps to an existing database. So if you have an existing database and it's managed by a DBA, then you're using database first if you then reverse engineer that into a mapping. Now, the one place where this actually becomes difficult or not difficult is how do you update that database? And this is I think what people primarily get stuck on. So you can use migrations, which is fundamentally about writing the code, and then from the code you create a migration that will update your database. Or you can have a DBA change the database and then you reverse engineer that into a code. But if you want to modify the code and have a DBA update it and merge those two things together, that's quite a difficult problem to solve, and something that did not work well in any version of EF really. In the designer, we had update from database, but it was very limited and often got things wrong or overwrote things. So there are patterns that you can use now with partial classes and various things to be able to change your code, but still just then reverse engineer your model into the database. And we've had Eric EJ has come onto the community stand-up and has talked about using the flows because he works on real apps. He's not Microsofty just doing these framework stuff, and he basically does what we would call a database first flow. The database is a source of truth, and doesn't use migrations. But we don't prefer one or the other. We strive to make both using migrations and reverse engineering from the database, both first class and as easy to use as each other. That being said, it's more complicated when you have both the code and the database changing independently of each other, and you want to reconcile those. Migrations has the advantage that there's one source of truth, and that's your code with your mappings, which you then create migrations from, and then the migrations run the database. And so I think that's when people say, well, nobody uses migrations and that model in production, but they do. Lots and lots of customers, big customers we talk to who do that. It works very well. And in the long run, it often tends to be easier just because you've got that single source of truth about how your database is formed. And then you also get obviously the nice up and down scripts and everything out of migrations that help you manage versions and update versions and all of that kind of stuff. So hopefully that covered it, probably in too much detail, but where do we go now? Should we? Can we look at an example of what? Let's look at an example of using dbContext in like a Razor page. So maybe we can just we'll go on the create, read, update. It's the best place to look.
Yeah, that's a good place.
Okay. What should I click on here? Maybe we need to go back to the getting started first, just to see where does the dbContext come into this?
The getting started is pretty much are you looking on the version? You can switch to version 6 over in the left if you want.
I can. Oh, okay.
There you go.
Preview. Didn't even know
that
was there.
Yeah, I've got this.
Very nice.
Updated for 6, so it uses the minimal hosting contest.
Very good.
Oh, wait a minute. You know what? This one's not updated. I apologize.
Because it's not on the live site yet, right?
Yep, it's not on the live site yet. But anyway, this is just the.
So these are our entities, right? So this is just defining the entities, and like we were talking about, this is a mapping attribute. So this in code says map this thing to a column in the database that doesn't have any generation. It's not database generated. And then hopefully we see. So here's our dbContext class. So injected with dbContext options and structure. That's the DI friendly way of doing things. So that ASP.NET Core basically uses dependency injection DI under the covers. So you have the add dbContext that registers that in DI, and then it will get and then this will be used to, those options will use to create your context. And then likewise, I assume that we and here's the piece. This is the bit that will be a little bit different in the minimal API. You won't have this configure services anymore, right, Rick?
Right.
But basically, it's still doing the same thing, which is adding a dbContext, this dbContext type, and telling it, in this case, I want you to use SQL Server with this connection string from my configuration. We'll skip over the database error page stuff. So then we've got some code here that this is before you get to migrations. So and actually Bryce has ideas of making it easier to transition from the just create my database to, oh, now I'm ready to actually start using migrations. But we do have ways at runtime that you can create the database just really quickly, just to get started on stuff without using any migrations. Just say, oh, just go create it. So that's what we're using here in the get started. And then we have initialize, which so we have seed. You can build seed database seeding into the model. You know, it was a good idea in some respects. It's not the best approach in a lot of cases. The best approach in a lot of cases is to do what we have here and have an initialize method that you call, and it just adds them and saves changes. You know, and when it starts here, it's just checking if there are any students in the database, and if it is, it's returning. So again, it's like simple is better, right? Yes, you can build it into the model, and the model can update it. We can keep it up to date. You probably don't need that in a lot of cases. This is easy, simple. Everybody can understand what it's doing. So,
and it provides a good. It's really great, especially when you're first starting a new application. So you have some data. You can do some testing. You know.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Talking about async code, so it's very important to always await any calls to async methods on the context. Don't think async doesn't mean in this case you can start a bunch of queries at the same time and then await them later. I won't go into the technical reasons why it doesn't mean that at this point, because we could be here for a long time. Fundamentally, though, if you make a call to toList async or changes async, always await it immediately, or at least before you do any other operation on the dbContext, which effectively in most cases means immediately. Skip over the performance thing. Oh, so EF core, when you do that add dbContext, it automatically connects into the ASP.NET logging framework. We fixed this actually in because this is a thing that you brought up, Rick. I remember we had a long discussion on it. So I was like, no, that you shouldn't need to do that. And then turned out that David Fowler and Damien Edwards in their wisdom had changed the way ASP.NET logging, so it was not showing EF core logging anymore. But that's fixed in 6.0 now, so you don't need to make this change anymore, and you'll get your queries in your ASP.NET core logs automatically. So that's awesome.
Yeah, that was quite an effort to get them to add that back in. I noticed on Stack Overflow there was a question: how did Diego in the EF Standup get SQL logging? And it had, over 50,000 people were hitting that, and they had the most elaborate and complicated code to get it. And through a lot of sleuthing and detective work, I finally figured out who the author of the article was, and I convinced him to change the answer to mine so it would be up at the top. And then I started campaigning to get this, change made. And with the help of Arthur and a little bit of pushback, they finally agreed, yeah, this is the right thing to do. But, if you're writing a new app, of course, on the development side, of course, you're going to want to see what's going on. You're going to want to see all that logging. It's very beneficial.
Yeah.
So
I think we've got to a good place in this where it's not logging too much, but it's logging the right stuff. So
and it's in development only. You would have to set that explicitly set that production, and typically you wouldn't want to do that. Probably more so on your test server, but
yeah. So in the same way that I don't see the code here. It might not be shown directly here, but in the same way that the dbContext options are injected into the dbContext, the dbContext itself is essentially injected into your Razor page. Is that the correct way to say it, Rick?
Yeah. So that would be on the next one. On their read. Let's see. I'm not sure they show a full page there.
Yeah, I think it's because you use scaffolding to get that right, and so if you use the scaffolder, it creates the Razor page that puts the context in, and so basically in your page you end up with this context. that you can use?
Jump down to the update the delete page.
Okay. So,
towards the bottom of that. If you
update.
there you go.
Right, here we
That's
go.
got the whole thing, and you can see in the constructor it's getting the context, the database context.
Right. So this is being injected by dependency injection container, along with it's injecting the logger as well. Save those away, and then when you need to do any activities on the database, you use that context instance and then write your link queries. So it's as simple as that, really. Do we have any other questions we should talk about? Nope.
There's some questions in the feed which we can answer if we want.
Okay. There's other things we can talk about here, but they're all getting into more esoteric things, like whether handling optimistic concurrency. We could talk about that.
Yeah, I think we should see the MVC version too, just to compare and contrast a little bit.
Right,
but we do have questions too that are definitely coming in.
So let's look here. So this is let's go back to update the delete page here. So you see here we're not seeing the whole page here, but essentially in the MVC, Rick can probably talk about this, but in the MVC you have a controller that's part of the model view controller pattern, and the controller is what gets your dbContext injected into. So this code is from the controller, and again you've got a context instance, and you're using that. Let's maybe look at.
So the big difference between the EF, the MVC, and the Razor pages is there's additional chapters. There's one on inheritance that we don't do in Razor pages, and we all chatted about this just before the show, and we decided we need to add the inheritance and the advanced topics to the Razor pages. And
right.
In the MVC, I mentioned in the pre-production meeting that it was out of date, and so we're looking for a little bit of help to get the MVC up to .NET 6. I think it's the last time it was updated was 2.1, so it's quite out of date. And Jeremy updated the Razor pages with best practices, so there's a lot of better queries in the Razor pages version. And SQLite's a first-class customer in the Razor pages. Everything works with SQLite and with SQL Server. So with the MVC version, you've got to do a little you've got to do some changes. So that's a couple things that I've got on goals that we'd like to do in the next few months, in the next 6 months, maybe.
Yeah, sounds good. So you can see in that this is the controller class. So instead of it just being in your Razor page, you have a controller class in the MVC that controls basically what's happening on the page. It gets data, it filters, it does whatever, and then I think we have this is the view, right, which is
right
written in this is just a HTML view. Or is this Razor 2? This is Razor 2. So explain. So tell us what Razor is for the completely ignorant web people like me.
So Razor Razor allows you to transition from anywhere on a page that looks like an HTML page. It lets you transition into C# and to run code on the page. And so that's basically what it's a page that looks like HTML that you can actually run C# code on.
So this is obviously HTML here, and then here we've got this for each statement, and it's going through each item in the model, and the model is the thing that EF, the controller, has created the model based on querying EF, and the model has whatever we're showing in here. people's last name, first name. So these are basically people in here. So students probably. And then obviously it's putting these into the HTML. So it's saying, okay, take the last name, use these HTML helpers and put that in. And then you've got this whole for each loop that is essentially C# page. So you've kind of combined it together in a way that's easy to read and easy to get your data from your model and put it into the view.
Even before that, the stuff you said that was HTML at the top of the file, that's really Razor HTML helpers that generate HTML. You know,
these here, yes,
that display for right. So
right. So this bit is HTML, right? The table, yeah. and then we're injecting stuff using the HTML helpers, which are the Razor bits here. So,
right.
Very cool. We assume people know this stuff, but always bad to assume that. So,
do we want to go through some of the questions that are coming in?
Yeah, sure.
Shai, did you have one in mind to start with?
Right. So, okay, there's one person asking Alfred Myers about plans of changing the restriction for await and async, which Arthur mentioned. So maybe it's worth saying a word or two about that. Exactly.
Do you want to talk, Shai?
Sure, I'll address it. I mean, the fundamental thing here is that if you're not awaiting something before starting another operation, that basically means you're running two concurrent operations against a database via the same connection. That's the fundamental point here. Async and await are not about necessarily doing things in parallel, right? They're about not blocking the thread as you're waiting for a response from the database. Typically, database providers, database connections simply don't support going and executing multiple queries at the very same time, which is why we don't support it either. So that's basically, I think, the short answer for all this. We could open another connection, but that would get us into the trouble of what if there's a transaction here? I mean, if it's two different connections, then they can't share the same transaction, at least not easily. So basically, the whole thing just doesn't work. It kind of breaks down. But you can always create another dbContext yourself and run another query in parallel on that. You just have to manage the different dbContext yourself. That's basically the fundamental point here. Arthur, maybe.
Yeah, so beyond what Shai said, there's also when you're using dbContext, dbContext itself is stateful and not thread safe. And what that means basically is that, for example, an easy example, that there's lots of state in there that's small and would just get you into trouble in occasional situations. But the easy example is a tracking query, right? So if you try and run two tracking queries at the same time, so you start one and you don't await it, and then you start another, then the first one is going to at some point come back into your context, the same single context instance, and start saying, oh, I'm going to track this, I'm going to track this, and then it's going to be interrupted by the other one coming in and saying, oh, I'm actually tracking this now. And in order to make that work, you effectively have to make the context thread safe, which is basically why the dbContext is not thread safe, and why we always kind of lump these things together. Because while async is not the same as like using different threads, effectively from the result of using a stateful object to consume the results of an async is effectively the same thing. So why don't we just make dbContext thread safe? The same reason that in Java, their first version of collections were thread safe, and then they made unthread safe collections. Basically, if you put the penalty on everybody to make something thread safe, then everything gets a lot slower. There's a lot more chance for what do you call those things where you get the bottleneck and the words is
contention.
Contention, yes. There's a lot more chance for contention in high throughput and everything. So from a practical perspective, as Shai said, the best way to solve that is not by making everything thread safe, but by using a different stateful object for each concurrent option. So that's why it's like if you've got two dbContexts, then great. Two different dbContext instances can, from multiple threads or concurrent actions, that's great. But if you try and use one stateful object in a concurrent way, then it's not going to work.
There's another question which I'd like to address here by Marcus about as no tracking. Are there any drawbacks to using as no tracking? And they say that the speed increase is noticeable. So tracking queries and no tracking queries, right? It's not as simple as it looks. So the simple version is that tracking queries, EF-Core basically tracks snapshots or tracks whatever you load, so that if you make any changes, EF-Core can tell that you've made those changes. And when you do save changes, it's going to persist those changes back into the database. When you're saying as no tracking, you're basically telling EF-Core, I don't need to do anything with these. Don't track this for me. So that removes the option to later save changes in an easy way. There are various ways to do that, but it's not via the easy kind of change tracking mechanism. So if you're telling EF-Core that you don't need to track the entities, then yes, in principle, that's going to speed up your application, because EF-Core doesn't have to snapshot what it's loading in order to compare it later. So the way change tracking works in the default case is if I'm loading a blog, EF-Core will transparently under the hood make a copy of that blog and keep it internally inside the dbContext. And later, when you do save changes, it's going to compare the blog which it saved, it snapshotted, to the blog which you've changed, basically. If it doesn't have to do all that kind of copying and comparing and all that kind of stuff, then you've saved a lot of, you've potentially saved a lot of, overhead. However, there are some interesting cases where using as no tracking can actually increase your memory usage and potentially even perf-wise. When you're doing a tracking query and you happen to load the same database row multiple times in the graph, because there's pointers in the database that would have you kind of load the same row twice. If you're using a tracking query, because everything is tracked in memory, EF-Core knows about it, and it's going to return the same instance multiple times. So it's going to return the same pointer. However, if you're doing a no tracking query, you don't have this mechanism, which means EF-Core is going to instantiate that database row. It's going to materialize it multiple times, which leads to a lot more memory potentially, right? So I think, I hope I covered this. I mean, Arthur is the expert here, obviously.
No, not obviously, but
you wrote it. You are the expert.
Maybe. So the question, a way of asking the question is, when do I decide? When do I decide to do no tracking, and when do I decide to do tracking? And it's kind of tautological in a sense. You do a tracking query when you need to track the entities. But let me elaborate on that. So let's take a typical MVC application, not MVC, ASP.NET application, or any kind of application where what you're doing is querying for a bunch of entities and then sending them off somewhere. So off to a web page, so to the client, basically. So at that point, if you're querying it and you send those off somewhere and then you throw away the context, then there's no point in doing a tracking query. You should do no tracking for that. On the other hand, if you're doing something where you're going to update those entities in that same context instance, or perhaps in that same context instance, don't use two contexts one for querying and updating and all that kind of stuff at the same time, because that just makes it even more complicated. So let's assume you're using the same context instance. So like in the delete code, I think we saw on there, you're querying for it, and then it's being tracked by the context. You're making a change for it, and you're calling save changes. In that case, use a tracking query always. Don't use a no tracking query and then try and attach those entities to that same context instance, because that's going to be both slower, and also you have the potential. Basically, when you're doing the attaching things, so you're doing disconnected entities, there's potential for you to lose information, such shadow properties, original values from the database. So you're losing a lot by doing that. So the real pit of failure is doing a no tracking query because you think it's faster, and then immediately attaching those with update or attach to the context. Don't do that. The one other place, as Shai alluded to, that you could use a tracking query even if you're not going to do an update, is where you actually have multiple different things that are aggregating data from different places. So, I might have one query that pulls in customers and then go off to another bit of business logic that pulls in something else. And rather than having to write one single query that puts all that together, it's often cleaner to just have a context. And this comes back to kind of the unit of work thing. You have a context for that unit of work. You query the customers, then you query the orders or whatever. And because of the change tracker brings those together, does what we call fix up, which means connects all the navigations and everything together, and that way you can end up with a collection of data that's all together, which by using EF Core to essentially do those connections. So that's the other case, but that's less common. So the fundamental rule again is don't do a no tracking query and then call attach or update immediately to attach them to a context. That's a bad thing to do.
So there's various other questions, but we're almost at the top of the hour.
Maybe one more.
What can we talk about? There's find or first or default. I think that's a worthy subject.
Yes.
By Fly Robin GG. Do you want to take that one, or should I, Arthur?
I can take it. So I don't see the question. Are you going to put it up on the screen? But it's basically when do I use find?
Yes. When one rather than the other. So firstly, find only works with a primary key. So yeah, you have to have the key. So if you don't have the key, which is actually quite common, then you're looking at doing first or default. Why is that the case? Why does find only use the key? Find fundamentally relies on the idea that we can exactly get the same result back from the database that we can locally, right? So for example, if I have a name, so if you say first or default by Arthur, and that's lowercase, uppercase, whatever, and it executes it on the database, it may not return, for example, if you're using SQL Server, it'll do a case sensitive, and so it might return the record, but then locally it's doing case sensitive and it might not return the record. And so we don't fundamentally know from a first or default whether or not we're getting the same result back from the database as you're doing locally. And there's a whole page on the docs about, case sensitivity and all that stuff. So we make the assertion that when you've got a primary key value, that we can look up an entity in the database with the primary key value and know exactly that we're getting the right thing back. And then we can look it up in the state manager and know exactly that we're getting the right thing back for that primary key. So that's why find only works with primary keys. We could make it work with alternate keys too, but that would require additional API to figure out what they are, and we haven't done that. But if you have the primary key, then find is mostly useful for not querying the database if your entity is already tracked. So what find will do is it will look into your locally tracked entities in your context and see if there is an entity with that primary key. And if there is, it won't even send a query to the database for it. Whereas when you execute a query always executes on the database. Even if that entity that it returns is tracked, it will still execute the query on the database, because basically it's saying the database is the source of truth here. This is the results from the database query are what I want to get. I want to consistently get the results from the database query. And so it might query that thing from the database even though it's already being tracked. So find is basically useful mainly if you want to look locally whether this thing exists or not. I will say we didn't add find in like the first versions of EF Core because, to be honest, that's not a huge advantage. So I will say that the other advantage of find is it's nice, it's easy to read, and people like calling it, and can make your code a little shorter and simpler. So that is perhaps maybe the primary thing. Like, use it because it makes your code easier to read and cleaner. But the looking in the state manager or looking in the tracking first is the primary difference in the behavior of the two. Well, we've covered a lot of different things. A lot of it related to ASP.NET Core, some of it more general, but it's been good. So, anybody have anything else before we sign off here? Give Rick some help with updating the MVC stuff. That would be great. We know a lot of people still use MVC, even though Razor Pages and your stuff doesn't mean you're not using MVC. So we still want to make that a great experience for everyone. So
you can use them both. You don't have to pick one over the other. There are times, there's some authentication things where MVC works better, and you can use them both.
Yep.
So it's not one or the other. you can't have different authentication on a get and a post with Razor Pages, but you can with MVC.
So mix and match.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, then I think we'll call it a day for this. Next time, 2 weeks' time, we have the incredible John Skeet coming here to talk about Noda time. So he's going to talk about what Noda time is, why you'd want to use it, why it's way better than the built-in BCL types for date and time. And then also we're going to talk about its integration with EF Core and use with databases, because there are extensions to use Noda time directly with various databases. So we're looking forward to that.
I have to say, anybody who's interacting with time in any way, which is basically any programmer in this world, I sincerely recommend seeing the session in 2 weeks. It's going to talk about databases, but it's also going to be general programming. What time zones are, how it works, what are the pitfalls, and John Skeet is the perfect person to give that kind of show. So I really strongly recommend the show we're going to have in 2 weeks. Also, it's a subject that's very dear to my heart. I've suffered a lot because of time zones and timestamps and all that stuff. So
yes, and it's one of those things that if you think you know how it all works and you're not John Skeet, then you probably don't.
Right.
So I'm sure I'm going to learn a lot, and I expect most people will as well. So
yes,
I'm really looking forward to that. So yeah, join us in 2 weeks' time, and also look for us in the .NET Conf and other great stuff. Okay, thanks everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Save the date for .NET Conf 2021, November 9th through the 11th for the .NET 6 launch. .NET Conf is our annual free 3-day virtual developer event co-organized by the .NET community and Microsoft, sponsored by the .NET Foundation and our ecosystem partners. For 3 days, you'll learn from featured speakers from the community and .NET teams at Microsoft, talking about .NET 6, C#10, Azure, Visual Studio, and more. This is your chance to learn, ask questions live, and get inspired for your next software project. We've got wall-to-wall content for web, mobile, cloud, desktop, games, services, libraries, and a variety of platforms and devices, all with .NET. Everyone is going to learn something, no matter if you're just beginning or you're a seasoned engineer. Don't delay. Head to www.dotnetconf.net. That's .NETconf.net to learn more and tune in.